Our next speaker, Amélie Hamad from University of Lille. She will present a paper titled Traveling Far Beyond the Strike of the City Clocks. She holds a master's degree in American literature from Université de Lille and is a laureate of the Aggregation France's highest teaching certification. She's preparing a PhD dissertation on boredom and American Romanticism. So please go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I am delighted to get the opportunity to give my first talk on the topic of boredom and American Romanticism. The previous talks have already given me plenty of ideas and references to explore, and I am very eager to hear your questions, which will help me complete and improve my research. I have indeed a master's degree from Université de Lille, but I will be a PhD student in American literature at Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in September. So, this paper investigates the articulation between boredom and time in Hawthorne's The Blithedale romance, chronicling the disastrous tale of a proto-socialist utopian community inspired by Fourierism. This semi-autobiographical novel weaves together contradictory views on this affect. A descendant of Puritans preoccupied by issues of sin and idleness, and by no means a convinced reformist, Hawthorne nevertheless took part to a Fourierist experiment in 1841. Although such a decision has been seen as surprising, his biographer, Brenda Wineapple, suggests that the union of thinker and worker was irresistible to a man whose conscience still carped about idleness and still considered writing a frivolous pastime, no matter how much he wanted to do it. The desire to find fulfilling occupation then appears as central for Hawthorne, who held various boring jobs during his lifetime. The novel that results from this utopian detour in Brook Farm paints an oddly funny and deeply disillusioned picture of such enterprises. Community in Blithedale is only superficial, and each character, be it Hollingsworth the philanthropist, Zenobia the feminist, Priscilla the lost woman, or Coverdale the poet, is only there to defend their own interests. It goes without saying that boredom, too, is inescapable. Optimistic contemporaries, such as Walt Whitman, frequently branded the topic of boredom as unmanly and un-American. He indeed lambasted what he saw as European mannerism in democratic vistas, instead of fresh local courage, sanity. The budding American literary world was plagued with dandies and ennuyés, dapper little gentlemen from abroad. No mal du siècle, no ennui on the other side of the pond, or so it seems. My contention will be that unlike his peers, Hawthorne sees boredom as a fact of life that is not to be battled, but rather accepted, performed, and even valued because of its subversive potential of rearranging our relationship with the passing of time. I will first examine the experience of time on Blithedale Farm, then study how gendered attitudes towards time and work still persist in the community, and I will finally analyze the poetic issues and narrative issues raised by reader boredom in such a narrative. So, At first, the Blithedale experiment seems to promise a regenerated relationship with work and the passing of time to its participants. Nevertheless, this promise soon turns to dust. In Chapter 2, the inaugural journey to Blithedale is described in those terms. Quitting a warm fireside, flinging away a freshly lighted cigar, and traveling far beyond the strike of city clocks, through a drifting snowstorm. The utopian previous life is described as a life of comfort and indulgence, whereas the drifting snowstorm evokes the first uncertain winter that the Puritans spent on American soil in the year 1620. Repeatedly, the city is described as the place where the passing of time is signaled by clocks. Hour by hour, the clocks in many steeples responded one to another. Blithedale promises a new way of feeling the passing of time, perhaps a more authentic one, and the Puritan reference recurs. With a family of old pilgrims might have swung their cattle over precisely such a fire as this, only, no doubt, a bigger one, and contrasting it with my coal grate, I felt so much the more that we had transported ourselves a worldwide distance from the system of society that shackled us at breakfast time. Disparaging clocks and everyday rituals in the expression shackled us at breakfast time, Coverdale seems to wish for a different kind of community, one that could be based on inner perceptions of time instead of relying upon the framework of time conventions measured by clocks. However, temporal notations do not fade away in Blithedale. And furthermore, Blithedale utopians, just like Thomas More's, awaken every day to the sound of a horn. Secondly, Blithedale's inhabitants seem to be looking for a more fulfilling way to spend their time, to enjoy it rather than endure it. Coverdale, the narrator of the Blithedale romance, described the enterprise of the utopians seeking to hopefully strive for and probably attain earthly happiness for themselves and mankind in the following terms. We had left the rusty iron framework of society behind us. We had broken through many hindrances that are powerful enough to keep most people on the weary treadmill of the established system, even while they feel its irksomeness almost as intolerable as we did. We had stepped down from the pulpit. We had flung aside the pen. We had shut up the ledger. We had thrown out that sweet, bewitching, enervating indolence, which is better, after all, than most of the enjoyments within mortal grasp. This paragraph occurs in chapter 3. Already, boredom is evoked in two contradictory ways. The hypology, weary treadmill of the established system, assigns the weariness felt by the utopians to an inanimate object. Of course, the metaphorical allusion to a treadmill conveys ideas of meaninglessness and punishment. Treadmills had indeed been introduced as a way to harness the energy of idle prisoners in 1810. Of course, the situation is intolerable. However, the narrator already wonders if that sweet, bewitching, enervating indolence may not be one of the best enjoyments within mortal grasp. This tension will remain at the heart of the novel. Finally, I would like to explore what I would call the failure of the romantic ideal of poetical work. At the time when Hawthorne is writing, social reformers and poets were examining whether or not work might be made pleasurable. Coverdale draws on such considerations when he explains the hopes that the utopians had when setting up the farm. While our enterprise lay all in theory, we had pleased ourselves with delectable visions of the spiritualization of labor. Each stroke of the hoe was to uncover some aromatic root of wisdom heretofore hidden from the sun. Pausing in the field to let the wind exhale the moisture from our foreheads. We were to look upward and catch glimpses into the far off soul of truth. In this point of view, matters did not turn out quite so well as we anticipated. Hawthorne is depicting an idealized vision of work in pre-industrial societies, when work obeyed to the rhythm of the who instead of that of the clock. The expression far off soul of truth sounds like an ironic reformulation of Emerson's Oversoul, which was supposed to represent a deep transcendental unity between human and world. Indeed, according to Hawthorne, our labor symbolized nothing and left us mentally sluggish in the dusk of the evening. Therefore, the Fourierist promise of a regenerated relationship to work and time is not fulfilled on Blithedale Farm. Not only do boredom persist in Blithedale, but so do gender roles and the repartition of work along gender lines. So this brings me to my second point, the persistence of gendered attitudes towards work and time in Blithedale. As the plight of women is voiced by the character of Zenobia, Blithedale has been considered to be a roman à clé, and Zenobia has been said to represent Margaret Fuller. Fuller was concerned with women's boredom, which stemmed in her view from the fact that they were not allowed to realize their full potential. In Woman in the 19th Century, she wrote, "She must stifle such aspirations within her secret heart and fit herself as well as she can for a life of resignations and consolations." Women are robbed of their time by social convention, which forces them to submit to biology, and Zenobia thus berates Coverdale in those terms. "Did you ever see a happy woman in your life? How can she be happy after discovering that fate has assigned her but one single event, which she must contrive to make the substance of her whole life? A man has his choice of innumerable events." And Coverdale answers, "A woman, I suppose, by constant repetition of her one event, may compensate for the lack of variety." So, of course, for Zenobia, women's life is boring because it is governed by the monotonous repetition of pregnancy and because of the limited range of occupations accessible to them globally. One of Blithedale's goals is then to offer women occupations fit to their individual aspirations. But is such a goal fulfilled? Unfortunately, and this is the second point of this second part, this goal is not fulfilled in Blithedale. At the beginning of the book, however, Zenobia evokes the idea of a possible diversification of occupations available to women in Blithedale. We will take the domestic and indoor part of the business as a matter of course, to bake, to boil, to roast, to fry, to stew, to wash, and iron, and scrub, and sweep, and at our idler intervals, to repose ourselves on knitting and sewing. These, I suppose, must be feminine occupations for the present. By and by, it may be that some of us who wear the petticoat will go afield and leave the weaker brethren to take our places in the kitchen. The assumption that women may repose themselves by knitting and sewing, that is to say, accomplishing even more work, rings as humour noir after such an accumulation of verbs. Such aspirations are never realized, and in one of the last words pronounced by Zenobia that we get to read, she voices her boredom, disgust, and disappointment. "I am weary of this place and sick to death of playing at philanthropy and progress. I have done with it, and Blithedale must find another woman to superintend the laundry, and you, Mr. Coverdale, another nurse to make your gruel the next time you fall ill." The attempt to free women from societal expectations ends in a resounding failure. So, the last aspect of this part dedicated to gender on Boredom will tackle the subject of politics. Zenobia's interest in politics is revolutionary because politics, it has been argued, is the manliest occupation and a remedy to boredom. The name of Thomas Carlyle is mentioned in Blithedale, and it is known that Hawthorne read on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history during his stay at Brook Farm, an essay that may be regarded as a formulation of the great man theory. Hollingsworth, a philanthropist obsessed with the reformation of criminals, has no doubts that he can influence history and tries to enroll Coverdale in his grand plans. Here is then the fairly long quote that I will study. Politics, by providing a worthy occupation to a man, can dispel any womanly boredom he might feel. The quote may serve as the inverted picture of Zenobia's replacing scrubbing, boiling, sewing, and knitting with abstract nouns associated with masculinity, strength, courage, immitigable will. Once again, Hollingsworth's language remains ambiguous, however, referring to the aimless beauty of Coverdale's life. It seems to imply that there is something worthy in the languor and vague wretchedness of an indolent or half-occupied man, although lacking in substance and desperately feminine. This soliloquy sounds ridiculous given that a far different picture of women's life as one of unceasing labor has previously been painted by Zenobia. Furthermore, Hollingsworth is not depicted as a positive character. It seems rather that his philanthropy alienates him. "And you call me tender," repeated Hollingsworth thoughtfully. "I should rather say that the most marked trait in my character is an inflexible severity of purpose. Mortal man has no right to be so inflexible as it is my nature and necessity to be." "I do not believe it," I replied, but in due time I remembered what he said. It seemed then that being so absolutely enthralled in a purpose is not a human way to live for Coverdale. This idea has conservative political implications and foreshadows the failure of the Blithedale experiment. This brings me to my last point, which will deal with boredom and narrative aesthetic. So, I will argue that in the Blithedale romance, boredom can serve as a narrative impetus. Hawthorne also seems to sketch a narrative aesthetic, which would not utterly exclude this effect. Boredom can impel artistic creation just as it can extinguish it. Its effects are unpredictable. In a way, it is boredom which allows the narrative to start driving the characters out of the established system. However, here is a remark given by Zenobia as the utopians are diverting themselves by creating tableaux vivants. "I am getting weary of this," said she after a moment's thought. "Our own features and our own figures and airs show a little too intrusively through all the characters we assume. We have so much familiarity with one another's realities that we cannot remove ourselves at pleasure into an imaginary sphere. It seems that true art needs individuality and solitude in order to unfold, a feeling that would align with Hawthorne's own views on the matter. Having spent 12 years in retirement at his parents' home, although empty and unpleasant, such an intimately desynchronous relationship to time seems to be a prerequisite to artistic production. It seems that I only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to skip to the link between boredom and the affirmation of the reader's freedom in Hawthorne's literary aesthetic. Coverdale is seen reading a boring book twice in the novel. The first string of books is a collection of Charles de Fourier's works, said to be horribly tedious volumes. Here a paradox is once again at play. Although horribly tedious, the books manage to catch Coverdale's attention. The paradox recurs in the second half of the novel, in which reading a boring book is seen as pleasurable. Here is my last rather long quote, which I am going to comment. In this quote, the rhythm of the narrative slows down. And interestingly, the book that Coverdale reads is a novel purchased from a railroad librarian. That is to say, a book designed to make its readers forget about the slowness of the passing of time. But it is not what happens. Here, instead, the book draws attention to the passing of time and accompanies this passing instead. In the physiology of the novel, Nicholas Dames isolates a Victorian mode of reading characterized by discipline and psychic commitments demanded by long novels such as Eliot's Daniel Deronda. Au contrario, he suggests that a different aesthetic may be detected with George Gissing. The novel form, I quote, goes along with cognitive permissiveness, which asks for nothing more than an occasionally fixated, intermittent, idle attention. The experience of reading is not seen as a way to ward off boredom through meaningful occupation orchestrated by a writer whose role is to captivate. It is also not considered to be an action that detaches the reader from quotidian life. It is put on the same plane as other mundane actions. Boredom becomes an interstice to explore, a brink to live on before plunging into this muddy tide of human activity and pastime. The value of a boring literary work, so it seems, is that it lets the reader choose what to keep and what to reject. In refusing to engross and absorb, it allows the reader to experience time for itself. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Amélie. Is there any question? Any question, commentaries? Yes, Manuel?
Yes, thank you, Amélie, for the presentation. It's a very rich project, and I think it's pointing in very interesting directions. I was trying to remember Blithedale romance and all the details in it, but I was also thinking about other works by Hawthorne that bear a relation to the question of time and boredom. In particular, I was thinking of those stories about the Fountain of Youth, which is a theme that Hawthorne wrote about, stories, essays, and above all, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, which is this story about finding the Fountain of Youth and drinking from it, and then stopping time on its tracks. So I wonder if can there be a connection between the kind of fantastic theme of the Fountain of Youth and this sort of utopianistic or utopianism at the Brook Farm, which is also trying to achieve some kind of timelessness, so to escape ways of measuring time or organizing time, or according to regimes of labor or consumption. So I guess you have the fantastic stories on the one hand, and you have the kind of parody critique of Brook Farm on Blithedale romance. But in the end, they're both trying to do the same with time. And interestingly enough, that timelessness is not boring, or is not, at least in Dr. Heidegger's, it's they want it. There's no critique there. So I don't know, this is just, I guess it's more of a comment, really. But that connection, my work somehow.
Absolutely, thank you. This is not something I was very focused on issues of work and self-realization, because the corpus of my PhD project revolves rather around Margaret Fuller. This text dealing with Utopia, the Blithedale romance, and the temple school experiment as well. So this was not the direction I was going to take, but I'm going to look into it. And definitely this theme of escaping the passing of time, remaining young, also recurs a lot in Hawthorne. Also, for example, in Septimius Felton, one of his unfinished works. So, in summary, to sum up, I did not consider this, but I will now. Thank you.
Annie? Annie, we can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just going to ask, because I saw in your presentation, and I think that's the bit that you sort of had to cut out. It was in regard to, I think it said something like the artist as the bore. So I was really curious to hear more about that. So does that imply that the artists are sort of bored themselves in order to create, or what was implied there?
So what I had in mind was this idea that I believe that for Hawthorne, captivating the reader should not be the aim of the artist. And in the Blithedale romance, the narrator, Coverdale, frequently insists on the fact that he is boring and he is but an eye, and he's not very, and that he is, first thing, he is not very interesting as a person, and second thing, what he says is not really interesting either. And he keeps hammering upon this. And this has, and here are some implications in my view. I think the first implication was that at the time, there was a budding literary market in America, and a market that Hawthorne frequently disparaged because it was governed by the production of women, and he believed that such productions were which had the aim of captivating were, in his view, extremely boring, and that since he did not want to captivate, contrary to this scribbling woman, his work was more interesting. So this would be one of the implications. And when it comes to this idea of the artist as an observer, almost like an empty receptacle of perceptions, this is something I am going to explore. And if you have references on this subject, I would be happy to get them. Because I don't think Hawthorne invented this idea of the artist as a receptacle of perceptions.